Thank you very much indeed, Peter. I'm sure a number of you have already got ideas or questions, things that you would like to ask. Would you like to take questions singly or in batches of 2 or 3?
Probably singly.
Singly, okay.
Get through.
Right. Who would like... Yes, Doctor.
You talk about sort of religion, and I was always sort of thinking that it is a vehicle for power, and that's very difficult to change because it's run by a conservative with a small c, and in order to maintain that power base, then if you change something, it can also erode that power. Have you got any sort of views on that sort of thing, or just, you know, or do you agree or disagree with that? Or?
Well, if you take the view of that various prophets did exist, what is mostly remarkable about them is the fairly simple life they led. In contrast to many religious leaders today who live in vast palaces. I mean, I suppose St. Peter's in Rome is the classic example. Jesus Christ advocated a church of the poor. Blessed are the poor, he said. Well, just look at the massive wealth of the Vatican. The wealth it has amassed over the centuries, often as a result of conquest, the Goths and Cologne. They looted and brought back to Rome great riches. So you're right, a lot of religion is about power. First of all, about a rather egotistical view that they have a personal, direct line of communication with God, that they are God's representative on earth. And indeed, that is the whole ethos of the papacy. The idea that the Pope is God's messenger on earth, that he has uniquely some special hotline to God and the ability to know and interpret God's wishes and God's law. So often we see that religion is intertwined with power, and of course we've had it in this country for many years. The Church of England was part of the state. The Church of England had its own religious courts, and it took many years of battles to eventually take away from the church the power to try people in religious courts and to make that a civil court matter or a criminal court matter. Likewise in Russia, there's no doubt the way in which the Russian Orthodox Church is tying its fortunes to President Putin is very much about seeking to ally religion with the state, with all the benefits that accrues. You know, the Russian Orthodox Church has privileged access to President Putin. You know, it is listened to. You know, its views, its policies are by and large, or increasingly, the policies of the Russian state. And it's no accident that, you know, it's all swings and roundabouts. You know, as Putin puts in legislation favourable to the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, he was last year, gave him some iconic award as a great Russian leader. You know, likewise in Iran, you know, the closeness between the state and the religious elite is, you can hardly put a cigarette paper between them. At the end of the day, we do have a parliament of sorts, although candidates are all very closely vetted. But there is a parliament in Iran. There was a president who's just not long ago been elected, although many of the opposition candidates were ruled out from standing. But at the end of the day, the real power in Iran lies with the supreme leader, who is the religious leader of Iran. He has the final say. No president and no parliament can override his wishes. And that is a very unhealthy concentration of power in one institution and in the hands of one man.
So how do you sort of get rid of this? Obviously, because, you know, if you accept the premise that it's a very conservative thing in England as well as Iran or whatever, that surely there's only one way to get around that, which is education.
Well, absolutely. Change will ultimately come from people of faith within these various religions. You know, we're seeing it in the Church of England, where the push for women bishops, for equal rights, for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people, it's coming from people of faith within the church. They are making the running. Likewise, within Islam, there are increasing numbers of what we might call liberal progressive Muslims who don't share hardline interpretations, who are seeking to rediscover and re-evaluate Islam's long tradition and to revive the more progressive elements, the tradition of ijtihad, which is about struggle, debate, contest. That tradition in Islam has to a large extent been lost, but it's now being revived. And that's a very healthy, positive thing. And those people will, in time, open up a debate. I can see it already. If you think back to the 1990s and the early part of this century, the Muslim Council of Britain worked hand in glove with the Christian Institute and other religious fundamentalist organisations to oppose every single gay equality law. In the name of religion, they opposed an equal age of consent, they opposed the repeal of Section 28, they opposed fostering and adoption of children by same-sex couples, they opposed civil partnerships, they opposed even employment protection legislation or protection against discrimination in the provision of goods and services. But when challenged, they began to rethink. And I tried for many years to have a dialogue with the Muslim Council of Britain, which is the main umbrella Muslim organisation in this country. The leadership was impervious, so I went and approached some of the younger people in the Muslim Council, particularly Inayat Bougamwala, who was then the media officer, and Abdul Rahman Jafar, who was then the legal officer of the Muslim Council of Britain. And I set up a personal dialogue with them to argue, as I'd done with Christian and Jewish fundamentalists, that discrimination is not an Islamic value, and that Muslim people should make a distinction between what they believe according to their faith and what the law of the land should be. And eventually, Inayat and Abdul Rahman were able to convince the Muslim Council of Britain to adopt that stance. So in the final stages of the passage of the new laws that outlaw discrimination against gay people in the provision of goods and services, the Muslim Council announced that it would not be joining the protests, that it did not support discrimination, and that it wished to support equality for all people. A complete turnaround on its previous stance. Now sadly, since then, there's been a change in the leadership of the Muslim Council, and in the last couple of years, during the debate about same-sex marriage, they have reverted to their old position of opposing marriage equality. But still, there's a debate going on, and it will continue, and ultimately, I'm certain that those progressive liberal Muslims who do believe in the principle of universal human rights, for people of all faiths and none, and people of all races and sexualities, I'm certain they will triumph in the end.
Thank you very much for your talk, and I think there's one problem I see with it is that in one sense you've talked about extremes, you've talked about some groups within religion, and have mentioned that there are other groups who, in religion, who are supporting what you want to do. And I, as a religious person, to a great extent would align myself with some of that, but not all of it. But my question goes back to the 20th century. We saw discrimination in some societies, like Stalin, like Cambodia, like when Mao was in China and so on, that didn't relate itself to religion. So the question I would ask, is discrimination something about human nature and not necessarily about organised religion? And even if we got rid of religion, as some people want to do so, we would still have discrimination.
No, I think you're absolutely right that persecution and oppression is not the sole privilege of religious bigots. There have been plenty of examples like the ones you cite, Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany, where great oppression has been visited upon people without any religious motivation. Of course, Hitler, for example, was quite closely aligned with sections of the Catholic Church, but there are equally many Catholics who rebelled against his rule and paid a terrible price in the persecution of Catholics, and indeed the execution of many Catholic dissenters and resistors to Nazi rule. Likewise, in Stalin's Russia, you have the irony that Stalin started out as a seminarian and then later became a great persecutor of people of faith. So you're right. I mean, these oppressions are not down solely and exclusively to religion. But I would say still that overall, looking at the range of different human rights abuses and who is supporting and driving them, that it is religious fundamentalist. Now, you're welcome to come back and suggest something else.
How much is, you talked about, in America, you talked about the fundamentalists being on the extreme. Extremes don't necessarily make majorities. So it's a case of really the sort of discrimination that you're against. Is it because of the religion, or is it because of some small groups within that, even though they may be significant? Or is it something that is whole, you know, you talked about organised religion, which seems to suggest it's coming from the centre. And I would say that if there is discrimination, it's because of human nature. And it doesn't matter whether we own to religion or we give up on religion, we will still find that there are pockets of discrimination.
What I'd say is that it's very clear that in the examples that I gave, that the motivation is religious. That because of the faith, these people are opposing equality and non-discrimination. But I think you're right, you know, in all of human history, you know, there are examples of exclusion, marginalization, persecution, discrimination, war and so on, that have not necessarily had a religious motivation. Although probably historically, I'd say that probably most of the wars in history, up until fairly recent times, have been religiously driven. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them. But you are right in that you know, there is something about human beings at a certain stage of mental, emotional, intellectual development which will predispose them to irrational thoughts, prejudices, ignorance, misunderstanding. It's very, very clear that where there is education, that people do become more accepting than if there's not. So, for example, it's very well known in research that a heterosexual person who knows a gay person will be much more favourably disposed towards gay people and much more likely to support equal rights because they know someone. Whereas those who've never met a gay person or never knowingly met a gay person will, on the whole, be more likely, not inevitably, but more likely to have fears, anxieties, and ignorance about homosexuality that presupposes them to discriminatory attitudes.
There was a person, yes, right in front of the window.
Through the course of human history, we know that terrible atrocities and massacres and cruelties are inflicted on people because of their religious beliefs. But we look in vain for uprisings of secularists and humanists committing the same kind of atrocities. Is it because people who believe in humanist values and secularist values don't have strong enough feelings, or are there more reason? It's a peculiar fact that the kind of violence that you have mentioned today, discrimination, does come from religious groups, not only ever from any group which is secularist or humanist. And that in itself seems to me to be, in part, a condemnation of religious belief.
I think it's true. People sometimes say, well, look, you know, some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century were committed by atheist regimes, such as Nazi Germany Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia. But the motivation was not their atheism. It was a political ideology that drove them to pursue those horrendous crimes against their own people. I think that, you know, when you look around the world today, most surveys show that people with no religious belief tend to be more tolerant and accepting of others. It's not a blanket thing, but as a general rule, people without faith tend to be more tolerant and accepting of others, particularly when it comes to women's rights and gay rights, which are the two real litmus test issues of our age. They have become, gender and sexuality have become the touchstones on which the world has divided. Not the only touchstones, but very significant issue. And you see it in the United Nations. You know, decades after the United Nations declared against racism and xenophobia, against religious persecution, it took decades for the United Nations to even issue a single statement condemning homophobic and transphobic persecution. And much of the opposition was orchestrated, of course, by religious-backed political leaders and blocs like the Vatican and the Organization of the Islamic Conference. You know, these were the powerful brokers in the UN that blocked initiatives around LGBT equality for decade after decade after decade.
There's a lady just in front by the window there. Yes.
I was continuing that line to say there's been obviously lots of violations of human rights across the ages from religious institutions and individuals. Is there any evidence that that is worse now than in, say, the last century, or is it always been there? So it's a continuation of the same question.
Tony,
I guess I'm just one of...
could you repeat your question?
Oh, sorry. This isn't long enough to take over. I don't think I can recall all of the question actually.
Try a bit louder.
Yeah.
There have been human rights violations by religious institutions across the piece. Is there any evidence that in the last century, say, this is deteriorating and becoming worse, or is it just bubbling along as it always has, which is a similar sort of issue?
I think the message is very mixed. On the one hand, it's undoubtedly true that in the last decade or two, there has been a revival of all kinds of religious fundamentalism. For example, in Nigeria, the mutual attacks between Christians and Muslims did not exist, or existed very marginally 20 or 30 years ago. But it's now very prevalent. And if you're a Muslim in certain areas, you're at real risk. If you're a Christian in other areas, you're at serious risk. And if you're an atheist or an agnostic or a humanist, you're at risk everywhere. So it's sort of, I would say the overall historical trend is towards greater equality and freedom, but there are backlashes taking place in a number of countries. And on lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender human rights, we see those backlashes in Russia, India, Cameroon, Nigeria and Uganda. And in most of those countries, the backlash is coming from various forms of religious fundamentalism. But on the other hand, you can see progress in other, at least nominally religious states, like Nepal and Vietnam, where LGBT rights is getting better, becoming more progressive, becoming more accepted, where even there's talk of legalizing same-sex marriage. If you look at many of the Muslim-majority countries, you can see a country like Lebanon, where there is an oasis of liberalism, despite the extremism of Hezbollah and the kind of regime they would impose if they ever felt secure enough to seize power. But you know, in Lebanon, women are fairly free compared to the rest of the Middle East. Even LGBT people are able to be free and organised within certain limits. I don't think there's ever been a gay pride parade in Beirut, but there is a gay rights organisation. It does hold events indoors. They have marched in some of the big mass protests for democracy and human rights with their rainbow flags. So there are oases of acceptance and space for even those minorities, or in the case of women, majorities, who otherwise have been persecuted.
Lots of hands now. Ross.
You just mentioned Uganda, and I think probably most of us are aware the President of Uganda has ratified, or is about to, some vicious anti-homosexual laws. And of course, it is Christian religious beliefs that are largely behind all this. So I wonder if you have any comment to make about the relationship between imperialism and this sort of religious intolerance, and also, more practically, what can we do to bring some effective opposition to the passage of these laws in Uganda?
Well, as you know, the vast majority of African countries still totally criminalise same-sex relationships. And in most cases, these criminalisations are the result of colonial-era laws that were imposed mostly by Britain in the 19th century. So the Ugandan statutes that have long existed have been imposed upon Uganda by the British colonial administration well over 100 years ago. So Britain brought those laws to Uganda. And indeed, all across Africa, there is no record of any anti-gay laws prior to the advent of imperialist conquest. Indeed, there is some anthropological evidence that in many African societies, homosexuality was either tolerated, or in some cases even accepted, venerated, and institutionalized. And indeed, in the colonialist imperialist narrative, the link between racism and homophobia is very close. The colonizing powers, in some cases very explicitly argued, the reason we need to colonize these people, the reason they need to be civilized, is because they practice the abominable behavior of homosexuality. So this idea of superiority, a superior culture, a superior society, was justified, colonial occupation and rule was justified, on the basis that these people were barbarians, and the proof of their barbarity was their toleration of same-sex relations. So you can see racism and homophobia went very closely together. Of course, the colonial administrators were backed up by Christian missionaries who went out to these countries in Africa, were horrified at lots of things they saw, including same-sex relationships, and preached and railed against them. And if you know a little bit about the history of the missionary movement in Africa, you will know it was often Scottish Presbyterians, rather fierce fundamentalists, who were the missionaries in those societies. They preached a hell, fire and brimstone version of Christianity. And of course, they changed the situation from the 19th century, where hardly any Africans were Christian, to a situation today where over 2/3 are, or about 2/3 are Christian. And they mostly tend to be from that hellfire and brimstone Christian tradition. So we have, as a country, a direct two-pronged responsibility for what is going on, and has been going on in Uganda and other African countries. We colonized them and imposed harsh anti-gay laws, and we sent out missionaries who ideologically, mentally conquered the people with the belief that homosexuality was a mortal sin. And we are still living with those consequences today. And so successful has that colonization been that, of course, many Africans proclaim that homosexuality is un-African, that opposition to homosexuality is an authentic African tradition, completely forgetting, a complete amnesia when it comes to the real history of how homophobia was imported to Africa. The real import to Africa is not homosexuality, it's homophobia. In terms of what we can do about it, well, the most important thing is to publicise and support the campaigns in African countries, not only by LGBT organisations, but also by mainstream human rights groups, and by a small minority of very brave, courageous Christians. I'm sure you're all familiar with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, one of the great heroes of the struggle against apartheid. He's spoken out against anti-gay laws, saying that they are akin to racism, that treating gay people in this way is akin to the way black people were treated under apartheid in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, likewise, supported a rainbow nation which included LGBT people. And his colleagues in the African National Congress argued, we did not fight for the liberation of South Africa to maintain any form of oppression, including the oppression of gay people. The ANC stood for a free South Africa where LGBT people would have an equal place in that society. We've also, of course, in Uganda, seen heroic witness of Bishop Christopher Senyonjo, a Church of Uganda bishop. Church of Uganda is part of the Worldwide Anglican Communion. Some years ago, he spoke out against the persecution of gay people and provided counselling and support to those who are victims of hate crimes and other inequalities and injustices. As a result, he was, in effect, excommunicated from the Church of Uganda. He was forbidden to conduct services and to provide communion. Eventually, he was even stripped of his pension. This is a man who's in his 80s, I think now, late 70s, early 80s. The Church of Uganda, part of the Worldwide Anglican Communion, has taken away his pension because he spoke out against the persecution of LGBT people in Uganda. And our Archbishops of Canterbury, Rowan Williams and Justin Welby, to my knowledge, have done nothing to criticise the youth of the Church of Uganda for their treatment of Bishop Senyonjo. They've done nothing, as far as I know, to support him or to provide assistance for the amazing work he's doing. Right now, he's running a refuge for LGBT people in Uganda who have literally escaped their villages because mobs tried to kill them. They've come to his St. Paul's Reconciliation Centre, where he's provided a place of safety. He looks after them, he cares for them, at great personal risk, because if the mob knew and discovered where this venue was, they would march in and not only kill the gay people, but probably kill him as well. So supporting people like him is really important. You know, I know it's a very simple and somewhat symbolic thing, but signing the online petitions. You know, when you get 1 million or 2 million people signing a petition against Uganda's anti-gay law or against the new law in Nigeria, it does carry some weight. It may not necessarily immediately change the law, probably not. But it certainly gives great hope and comfort to LGBT people and their straight allies in those countries. To know that people in the outside world care, that's really important. The other thing we can all do is to write to our members of parliament and urge them to write letters of protest to the ambassadors of these countries and urge the British government to not cut aid, but switch aid. No government that violates any human rights should be in receipt of British aid or any aid. You know, the aid should not be cut because that would punish poor, vulnerable people. who depend upon aid for clean water, food, and so on. But what we can do is switch that aid from oppressive anti-human rights governments to NGOs and aid agencies that do not discriminate. So the aid still gets to poor, vulnerable people, but just the government is not rewarded. The government gets the message that its behaviour is beyond the pale.
Thanks. Sorry. Yes, about 4 across from Ross. We haven't done one in that area. That's right. Mike.
I wonder if it's a little bit more complicated. I mean, in fact, it's easy to gain support for conflict views in the population. There's a tussle going on between Islam and Christianity. If one camp is going to wants to preach against homosexuality and the other group doesn't, then who gets the more converts? Where do they go? So I think there's a battle. And I think Welby doesn't want gay marriage for clergy. Why doesn't he? Because I suspect if he's going to remain, Canterbury is going to stay at the centre of the worldwide Anglican fellowship, then he can't alienate most of Africa. So I sometimes wonder whether, in fact, it's far more complicated than we actually imagine. We just say another thing. We put Putin on the spot over this legislation. He's bound to know because he's got the West shouting at him, don't do this, don't do that. Well, hang on. They're a country trying to sort of project themselves in the world, and they're going to show this resistance. Same with Uganda, I think. If outsiders keep shouting in, still know what you do, because I think we should be saying that all it does is to promote and encourage these people to go ahead. Simply to show their independence, a young nation, we can make our own decisions type thing.
Well, of course, I do not approach any of these issues from the Western perspective. I don't approach it from the issue of Western values. My lodestar is the principle of universal human rights, which every nation that signed up to the United Nations is agreed upon. Every member of the United Nations has agreed to uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's a universalist principle, not a Western principle. That's the first thing. Secondly, the initiative against these oppressions comes primarily from within. The campaigns in the West are merely to support brave, heroic people in these countries. They are leading the fight, we're supporting them. So it is an internal battle between the powers that be, who promote these anti-human rights laws, and the population, sometimes a small minority, but the population nonetheless, who resist and oppose them, who do stand for the principle of universal human rights. So in all these countries, Russia, Uganda, Nigeria, my argument is always, these laws violate your own constitution. Article 21 of the Ugandan constitution guarantees equal rights and non-discrimination to every Ugandan citizen. The same with Article 42 of the Nigerian constitution. Both Uganda and Nigeria have signed up to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Articles 2 and 3, which guarantee equality for all. In Russia, the constitution specifically guarantees non-discrimination and freedom of expression. The new anti-gay law quite clearly violates both. So it's really trying to hold these countries to account to their own laws, their own constitutions. And that is the big challenge, because for many, long time, their own laws and their own constitutions have been interpreted in a way that did not include, for example, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender people. The struggle is to get that recognition. It's like lots of laws, we've got the European Court of Human Rights, We've got the European Convention on Human Rights. The anti-discrimination clauses do not specifically protect people against discrimination on the grounds of age, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so on. There's lots of things that are not covered by the European Convention, but over time, the European Convention has been interpreted by public and government consensus to cover all areas of discrimination. So that really is the challenge in terms of getting these countries to take on board an interpretation of their own laws and constitutions that embraces everyone. The other point you raised about the rivalry between Christianity and Islam, this is a very real battle. And it's true that some Christian leaders say, if we don't oppose homosexuality, this will give ground to the Islamists, that Islam will gain strength and we as Christians will lose it. Well, I would say that kind of realpolitik has no place in Christianity. You know, Christians are supposed to stand for principles of love and compassion. And the way to defeat the homophobes is not by giving in to them, but by questioning and challenging them, by taking on board their viewpoint and refuting it. And that may, in the short term, lead to a loss of some support. It may well. But in the end, it will probably work out for the best. No guarantee, of course, but probably. And I think, you know, people of faith do have to stand by values, principles, and ideals, even if it is discomforting, as it was for Christians who stood out against Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany. They didn't take the easy road, they took the hard road based on a sincere belief in the humanitarian values that they saw as being at the heart of their faith. That's what we need now. As for the idea that the imperative is to hold the Anglican Communion together, I can understand why successive Archbishop of Canterbury may take that view, but I don't think it's a morally tenable one. Unity at any price is not a unity worth having. If unity means colluding with extremists in the Church of Uganda, the Church of Nigeria, and so on, then I think it is better that the Church of England splits. It is better to have two separate churches. To do otherwise is a slap in the face to the victims of those Christian persecutions in Nigeria and Uganda. So I would say the Anglican Church in this country and all countries should stand for the principle of universal human rights, including the rights of women and gay people. And if some parts of the church can't accept them, let them go their own way. Let the church divide rather than hold it together in a system of church tyranny.
Yes.
Yes, your topic is organised religion, and organised religion has an incredibly strong foothold in the BBC. Earlier today I was listening to something called Beyond Belief, where a discussion was extremely superficially taken about the decline of religious belief and faith and observance. But in the group discussing it, there was no atheist, no humanist, no secularist, almost entirely people with a degree of religious commitment. So, bearing in mind the attitude of the BBC, I wondered whether you yourself, in discussing your views on the promulgation of the BBC, how much agreement or resistance have you met? How far have you got? And what hope do you have for the BBC?
I don't think it's a problem just for the BBC. I think a lot of broadcasters and wider media do give a disproportionate airtime to people of faith and religious views. Of course, because they're part of society, they should be heard. They have a right to have their voices heard, but not, as you suggest, to the exclusion of people with no faith. And certainly, the balance in many of these discussions is seriously lacking. So often, as you say, you get a panel to debate an issue which will consist of a whole series of variants of religious faith and belief, with no one who's agnostic, atheist, secularist or humanist. And that is unbalanced. How do we change it? Well, we just got to keep on lobbying the BBC and other media to make sure that when these issues arise, there are non-religious voices as well. We are not saying exclude the religious voices. They should be part of it. But do make sure that there are non-religious voices as well. So again, get your MP to write to the BBC Director General making these points. If lots of people get their MPs to write, and indeed they're members of the European Parliament as well, then it will make the BBC sit up and take notice. They often say that it only takes about 30 people writing on an issue to get the BBC to sit down and think about how to respond to such a representation. They do take it seriously. Sometimes the result is not what we want to expect, but the more people we can get lobbying the BBC, the better. And if those of you who don't know how to lobby your Member of Parliament or European Parliament, go to the website writetothem.com, as in writetothem.com. It'll ask you to put in your postcode, and then it will tell you who your MP is and who your members of the European Parliament are, and you can email them direct from that website. And they will get it, and they'll respond to it just like you emailed them directly from your own account or you sent them a letter. So it's a really easy, effective way to lobby your Member of Parliament.
There's somebody right in the back corner who's been waiting. Yes?
Yeah, I'm a Franciscan friar, a Catholic priest, and a gay man. And I'm an admirer of Peter, of you and your work. I don't agree with everything. But my understanding of my faith is that it's about the holistic liberation of people, politically, sexually, etc., etc. And sometimes an unorganized religion, like say organized church, are meant to facilitate that, and sometimes they get powerful in the way. But I wonder, and I agree with your universal rights, that those of us who try to work within the system, we as Franciscans are supposed we work, at least we try to work on the marginalized groups in society as well as the institution of churches. So I agree with universal rights, and that faith groups should not have privileged access, or it shouldn't be enshrined at legislation. But I wonder, you made a distinction between Islamicists and many Muslim people, and I would draw a parallel distinction between fundamentalists, Christians, Catholics. I've been around some fundamental Catholics, scaring people. Fundamentalists of any faith, there's a distinction between the fundamentalists do not define the movement. I would say fundamentalist Catholics do not define the Christian or the Catholic movement. They distort it. They decide they can be very powerful. So I take from your talk, which is very interesting, that it's the religious fundamentalists are the greatest threat maybe to human rights, and organized religious fundamentalists. But I don't underestimate the power and the negative part of organized religion, and I would be a very critical member of my own church as well. But thank you, very interesting.
Well, thank you, and perhaps we might nominate you for the next Pope.
That would be a safe pair of hands.
Well, exactly. We don't need safe pairs of hands, we need compassionate pairs of hands, or compassionate hearts and minds.
There's a lady just here at the front.
Earlier I heard you saying about religious extremists and fundamentalists being intolerant, and that usually people who are without religion generally are more tolerant. But when I was hearing that, and I was thinking about the, given the access to those in power, religious leaders, to the media and things like that, which people have touched on, of the permeating effect. So I see many people now who are pretty secular, not religious, but still, for me, I'm just wondering about the influence when you hear negative statements by religious leaders about homophobia, homosexuality, same-sex marriage and things like that, that it then legitimises those what might be seen as thuggery acts, that it's okay to, attack somebody in the street or to call names or to do this, that and the other. So my point is, your thoughts on ways to challenge, both, obviously you've suggested some things in terms of challenging some of that at in media levels and other things, but also on that permeating level, where it then, even people who aren't religious, don't follow those religions, that when I hear in the statements on the news, such and such has said it's an abomination and that kind of thing, and as somebody who is in a same-sex relationship with 2 young boys, I'm thinking I don't want them to hear that, because at the moment they just are happy, carefree, and I know at some point they're going to get aware of, somehow their family, something wrong and all the rest of it. And we have as a family been, in a previous house we lived in, been directly under attack, so we've, got very direct sort of experience of that. So just your thoughts on ways that can be challenged on different levels, really.
Yeah, I think a lot of homophobia that is not directly religiously motivated or driven comes out of fear and ignorance. People are afraid of the other, the different, the person they don't know or understand. And so I think education has a very important, powerful role to play. I've long argued that equality and diversity lessons should be mandatory in every school, from the first year of primary school onwards, to challenge all forms of prejudice, racism, anti-Muslim prejudice, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and so on. Because we know that young people are not born bigoted, they become bigoted. Under the bad influence of parents or adults or peers, young kids get prejudiced ideas. And if this education existed from an early age, where people were made aware of others who are different and to understand, the experiences of black or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu people, I'm certain that would, over time, reduce the likelihood that those kids would grow up to be prejudiced. And there's been some experiments in some cities and countries with these kinds of classes, and generally the overall effect has been very positive. There has been a noticeable decline in playground teasing and taunting, much less bullying, and in later life those young people have grown up to be much more understanding and accepting of people who are different. So I think that's sort of something that ought to be part of the national curriculum. Education is about preparing young people for later life. In later life, they will meet people who are different from themselves. They ought to have an understanding of people of faith, people of no faith, people of different races, ethnicities, genders, sexualities. The fabric of life, the aspects, the diverse aspects of life, ought to be something that they are conscious of and able to deal with. And it'd be great if parents did this. It'd be fantastic if parents did it, but often they don't. Partly because they don't know how. So therefore I think it's down to the school system. The school system can challenge prejudice and can create, or help create, a more inclusive, kinder, gentler society.
Just behind that way is, yes, gentleman there. Yep. Oh, right, come to you then. Sorry?
After the judgment.
All right, I'll take first you and then you, if that's okay.
Please.
Yes, thanks. Yeah.
You ready? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Are you overly concerned about the Conservative-led government's threat to ditch human rights legislation, or do you think that's just political posturing in the next general election? Or do you think that it would be a big setback to the perception of Britain as a liberal democracy if it did ditch that legislation?
The question is about Conservative rumours or threats to ditch human rights law. I would say that the Human Rights Act is probably the single most important legislation of the post-war era, because it guarantees us all equal rights and protection against discrimination. So it's a bulwark against prejudice and against overbearing government. It states a limit beyond which the state may not encroach. And that is very important in terms of individual liberty. So any attempt to repeal the Human Rights Act or to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights would be a retrograde step. I don't know whether it's posturing or whether they're really serious, but David Cameron and others have said it many times, they want, to scrap the Human Rights Act and replace it with a British Bill of Rights. What this British Bill of Rights would contain, they never say. But certainly it's not going to be as good as the Human Rights Act. Likewise, if we pull back from the European Convention, that would be the loss of an important safeguard. Because even under the Human Rights Act, it is not absolute. Under the Human Rights Act, there is a clause which does allow Parliament to override the judges. So it's very important to have the safety net of the European Court of Human Rights, which has been responsible for many, many positive advances and protections in our rights and freedoms. People keep on giving, extreme, bizarre examples of things that the European Court may have ruled on, but they forget the really good, positive things in terms of women's rights, pensions, employment protection, gay rights, and many other instances where the European Court has been our defender. It has safeguarded and protected us against a government that sought to undermine those rights and freedoms. So we must resist it very strongly.
Chap just behind you.
Peter, in your talk you made a clear distinction between fundamentalism and also the progressive religious people, the friendly, fuzzy sort of cup of tea and cucumber sandwich types. There's a lot of talk, I think Dawkins considers them to be enablers of fundamentalism. How do you feel about that? Are they the thin end of the wedge or are they allies?
I think when we assess religion and people of faith, we need to look at practical consequences. Now, I am a secularist, a humanist, an atheist. That's my perspective. To me, religion is a form of superstition. It's not rational. I think a scientific understanding is a better way of understanding our place in the world, where we come from, where we're going to. Scientific knowledge is the key to enlightenment. Of course, we also need an ethical guide, but we don't need religion for that ethical guide. The ethical guide is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the European Convention on Human Rights, in the Human Rights Act. For me, people who hold religious views but do no harm, I'm not much fussed by them. I don't see people who have a faith as being intrinsically an enemy of human rights. It all depends on how they interpret that faith and how they put it into practice. So I'm not worried by the nice, gentle, Christians or Muslims or Judaists or Hindus or Sikhs. I'm not worried by them just because they hold their views. I'm only worried when they seek to use their faith to attack and deny other human beings their rights and freedoms. And, despite the politicizing by fundamentalists, I don't see any evidence that the if you like, the low-level Christians who are merely practicing their faith and not harming anyone. I don't see them as a conveyor belt or gateway to extremism. But that's my view.
Well, thank you very much. Because Peter does have to get a train back to London, I think, is that, by the end, yes. We have had
We
pretty much...
can take one or two more, but I think we have to finish, the next 2 or 3 minutes we have to finish up. But
Somebody
Yeah.
over in the corner that's been waiting.
All right.
right.
I have an observation actually.
Can you shout?
I have an observation. I used to be Anglican, and I was friendly with a couple of, and one of them was a woman who wanted to be ordained in the Anglican Church. And she was a liberal, right? She was probably more liberal than you are. And I said to her, we're talking about women bishops, and I said to her, would you ever think of becoming a bishop? And she said, oh no. She'd be perfectly qualified, she'd probably be a very good archbishop. But I think what I find in my experience is that the liberals, the good people, tend to not want positions of power. They tend to demonstrate humility. Right. So the very idea of power tends to be occupied by those who are nefarious, careerists, and ambitious. But I think to be more optimistic, I think there's something to be said for Dawkins' kind of moral zeitgeist argument. We believe what we believe now because we're in the 21st century in Britain, right? If we'd have been in 1903, we'd probably say bad things about homosexuals. So I guess my point is that as, say, Muslim societies evolve, as African societies evolve gradually and develop more, won't all this prejudice and irrational behaviour simply disappear over time anyway, with development?
Well, certainly there's quite a body of evidence which suggests that more educated people tend to be less homophobic, less racist, less misogynistic. So obviously, there's pretty strong evidence that suggests that education is a key part of overcoming prejudice. That if people have an intelligent, rational, critical, skeptical, thinking mindset, they are less likely to buy into fundamentalist religion or indeed any kind of political extremism. So education is, to me, part of the process, which is why I mentioned the equality and diversity lessons as one idea about how we might achieve that. I think there's absolutely no doubt that in many, many different societies, people who have come into contact with black and ethnic minority people, LGBT people, people of minority faiths, tend through that contact to also have a different perspective. It helps disabuse them of their prejudices or their preconceptions. So encouraging inter-community relations, to encourage people to mix together is a good thing, which is why faith schools are such a bad thing, because they segregate. And I think, if you want to have an inclusive society, segregating education based on religion, even if you might accept some people of other faiths or no faiths as part of your intake, it's still a basically fundamentally bad idea. I think every child should be educated in the same kind of quality school, so there's a mixing of people of all faiths and none, of all races and none, and so on. That inclusive approach to education, I think, is the key to overcoming prejudice, all prejudice.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm sure we've all had a very stimulating and interesting evening and have heard lots of very interesting ideas from Peter, and I'm sure we'd all like to show our appreciation now.
Can I just thank you all once again for coming this evening and for contributing to the debate and listening. Hopefully it's given some food for thought. Please do support the Nottingham Secular Society, who's hosted tonight's event. And can I also ask you that if you're interested, please come and take one of my flyers about my Human Rights Foundation. Gives you information how you can sign up for free to our campaign e-bulletins. And also please consider making a donation, because we are entirely dependent upon donations from well-wishers. We don't receive any kind of institutional funding. The amount of money we get so far is really tiny. And we're trying to persuade 1,000 people to donate £5 a month, the equivalent of a couple of beers or so. £5 a month would give us a stable, secure income to carry on the human rights work we're doing here in Britain and around the world. So please do take a postcard or two. Maybe you can find a friend or family member who's perhaps sympathetic and persuaded to sign up and donate as well. But thank you all very much for coming tonight, and best wishes in the work that you do, because I'm sure, looking around this room, there are many people who are working in many different ways to advance the cause of human rights, and all your efforts are valued and appreciated. Thank you.